Upon hearing a young woman singing in a square, a millionaire was paralyzed upon hearing the song. The same one his beloved used to sing before she disappeared 25 years ago. The day was quiet, but Alfred's mind was anything but. He walked through the park after yet another exhausting business meeting, his thoughts a tangled mess of numbers, strategies, and deals. He had built an empire, one that had brought him wealth beyond his wildest dreams. Yet, as he strolled along the tree-lined path, a deep loneliness gnawed at him. The kind of loneliness that no amount of money or success could fill. It had been 25 years, and still, the absence of Catherine, the woman he had once loved so deeply, haunted him. He remembered the day she vanished as if it were yesterday. One moment, they were planning their future together, and the next, she was gone. No explanation, no trace. He had searched for her, of course. Hired investigators, scoured every corner of the city, but nothing. As the years passed, he buried himself in work, telling himself that success was the only thing he had left. But no amount of power or wealth could erase the memory of Catherine. Suddenly, a sound broke through his thoughts, a melody. It was soft, barely audible at first, but it carried through the park like a gentle breeze. Alfred stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. That song. It was the same one Catherine used to hum when they were together. He turned his head, searching for the source of the music. There, sitting on a bench not far from where he stood, was a young woman. She was humming the tune, completely unaware of his presence. Her head was slightly bowed, her long, dark hair cascading over her shoulders. Alfred's breath caught in his throat as he approached her cautiously. There was something familiar about her, something that sent a jolt of recognition through him, though he couldn't quite place it. As he got closer, his eyes widened. The young woman looked almost exactly like Catherine, the same soft features, the same gentle expression. It was as if time had rewound itself, and Catherine was sitting before him once again, though younger, almost as young as when they had first met. His pulse quickened, and an overwhelming sense of déjà vu washed over him. She looked up, noticing him for the first time, and their eyes met. Alfred felt a chill run down his spine. The resemblance was uncanny. For a moment, he couldn't speak. He stood there, staring, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Excuse me," he said finally, his voice rough from the shock. I couldn't help but notice the song you're humming. It's beautiful. Where did you learn it?" The young woman smiled softly. "Oh, it's something my mother used to sing to me when I was little. I guess it just stuck with me." Alfred's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to ask more questions, to dig deeper, but he forced himself to stay calm. "That's interesting. It reminds me of someone I used to know," he said, his voice steady, though inside his emotions were in turmoil. "What's your name, if you don't mind me asking?" "Valerie," she replied, tilting her head slightly as if studying him. "And you are?" "Alfred," he said, feeling the weight of her gaze. There was something about her, something more than just her appearance, that drew him in. He couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more than just coincidence. "Valerie?" He repeated her name, as if tasting the sound of it. It felt strange on his lips, but also familiar. They fell into a brief silence, with only the faint rustling of leaves filling the air. Alfred's mind raced with possibilities. Could this young woman be related to Catherine? A distant niece or a cousin? Or was it just his mind playing tricks on him, projecting his memories of Catherine onto this stranger? "Are you from around here?" he asked, trying to keep the conversation going without seeming too eager. He needed to know more. "Sort of," Valerie replied. "I've lived here for a few years now. My mother and I moved around a lot when I was younger, but we've settled here for the time being." Alfred nodded, absorbing her words. His curiosity was piqued even further. There was a mystery here, one that he couldn't ignore, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he thought he'd lost: hope. "Listen, Valerie," he said after a pause, his voice careful. "I don't want to intrude, but I might have an opportunity for you. I run a business, and we're always looking for talented people. If you're interested, we could talk more about it. Valerie seemed surprised by the offer, but there was a spark of interest in her eyes. That's unexpected, she said, smiling. But I'm open to hearing more. Alfred nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief. He didn't know what he was getting himself into, but something told him that this was the beginning of something important, something he couldn't turn away from. As they exchanged contact information, Alfred's mind was already racing ahead. He needed to learn more about her, and this was the perfect opportunity to do so. And perhaps, through Valerie, he could finally uncover the truth about what had happened to Catherine all those years ago. Alfred couldn't shake the strange feeling that had taken root in his chest after meeting Valerie. There was something about her that kept gnawing at him, something beyond her striking resemblance to Catherine. He had spent decades burying his emotions, locking them away behind the walls of his business empire. But now, for the first time in years, those walls were beginning to crack. The next day, as he sat in his office, the world of contracts and boardroom meetings felt distant. His mind kept drifting back to the park, to Valerie's smile, to the melody she had hummed so naturally, like a ghost from his past. The resemblance was too much to ignore, and he couldn't get past the gnawing question, who was she really? He picked up the phone and dialed the number she had given him. Hello? Valerie's voice came through, soft and slightly surprised. Valerie, it's Alfred, he said, keeping his tone casual. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I'd like to formally offer you a job at my company. We have an opening that might be a good fit for you, and I think it could be a great opportunity. There was a pause on the other end. Alfred could almost hear her hesitation. That's very generous of you, Alfred, but I don't know much about your company or what kind of work it would be. Alfred smiled, though she couldn't see it. Nothing too complicated. We'd start you with something simple, and you could learn as you go. It would be a chance to grow and develop your skills. How about we meet up, and I can explain the details? Another brief silence. He could sense the wheels turning in her mind. Okay, she finally said. I'll give it a try. That evening, they met again, this time in a more formal setting. Alfred had arranged for them to meet at a quiet cafe downtown, away from the distractions of his office. When Valerie arrived, she looked a little nervous but greeted him with the same warm smile. I'm still not sure what exactly I'm signing up for, she admitted as she took a seat across from him. Alfred chuckled, feeling a strange sense of ease around her, something he hadn't felt in years. It's nothing overwhelming, he assured her. We have a number of entry-level positions where you could get started. The important thing is that you'll have a place to grow. If you're interested, I'd love to help you build a career. Valerie tilted her head slightly, studying him. Why are you doing this for me? You hardly know me. Alfred's heart skipped a beat at the question. Why was he doing this? He wasn't entirely sure himself. Was it because of her uncanny resemblance to Catherine? Was it because something inside him longed for a connection he'd lost long ago? He wasn't ready to answer that yet. At least, not out loud. I believe in helping people with potential, he said instead. And you seem like someone who deserves a chance. Valerie looked down at her hands, clearly touched by his words. I don't know what to say. No one's ever offered me anything like this before. You don't need to say anything right now, Alfred said, leaning back in his chair. Just think about it. If you decide to join us, we can start as soon as you're ready. After a moment, Valerie nodded, her smile returning. All right, I'll give it a shot. They spent the next half hour discussing the job, with Alfred doing his best to explain the logistics. Valerie seemed more comfortable as the conversation flowed, and by the end, she had agreed to come into the office the next morning to sign the necessary paperwork. Alfred, on the other hand, could hardly concentrate on the specifics. His mind was racing with questions, doubts, and suspicions. As they wrapped up, Alfred hesitated for a second, then asked, Valerie, you mentioned that your mother used to sing that song to you. Can I ask, does she live here? In the city? Valerie blinked, her expression softening. Yeah, she does. We live together, actually. It's just the two of us. She doesn't get out much, though. She's been unwell for a long time. Alfred's breath caught. His pulse quickened, but he kept his tone even. I'm sorry to hear that. What's her name, if you don't mind me asking? Valerie hesitated, her eyes flickering with a hint of caution. Her name is Catherine. Alfred's heart nearly stopped. Catherine. It couldn't be. Could it? After all these years, could the woman he had lost, the woman he had searched for, still be out there? Alive? He swallowed hard, trying to control the surge of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. He wanted to ask more, but he didn't want to alarm Valerie. I see, he said carefully. I hope she's doing all right. Valerie shrugged, her expression turning a little sad. She has good days and bad days. She doesn't talk much about the past. Sometimes it's like she can't remember things. Other times, she just doesn't want to. Alfred nodded, though his mind was spinning. He needed to know more. But how? How could he possibly ask Valerie if her mother was the same Catherine who had disappeared from his life 25 years ago? It was too much, too soon. I understand, he said, trying to sound casual. Maybe I'll meet her someday. Valerie smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. Maybe. As they parted ways, Alfred's mind raced. He needed answers, but he couldn't rush this. For now, he would focus on getting closer to Valerie, and perhaps, through her, he would finally learn the truth about what had happened to the woman he had never stopped loving. The following days passed in a blur for Alfred, consumed by the questions swirling in his mind. Was it really possible? Could Valerie's mother truly be his Catherine, the woman who had vanished without a trace all those years ago? He was caught between disbelief and hope, unsure of what to think. But one thing was certain. He needed proof. His instincts, honed by years of navigating the cutthroat world of business, told him not to rely on coincidence alone. He needed something tangible. The idea had come to him the night after their last meeting, a DNA test. It was the only way to know for sure if Valerie was his daughter. The very thought sent a shiver down his spine. If it were true, then everything, his life, his purpose, would change forever. Alfred had always been methodical, and this was no different. He couldn't risk scaring Valerie away by telling her his suspicions outright. Instead, he formulated a plan. He would need a sample of her hair, something small enough to not arouse her suspicion. His stomach churned at the thought of going behind her back like this, but he convinced himself it was necessary. He needed to know the truth. On the pretense of welcoming her to the company, Alfred invited Valerie to his office to sign some final paperwork. She had been excited about the job, and he could see a sense of determination in her, as if she were eager to prove herself. They chatted lightly as she sat across from him, signing the documents. But Alfred's mind was elsewhere, constantly searching for the right moment. As Valerie reached to gather her things, her long, dark hair brushed against the edge of the desk. There it was, his chance. He discreetly grabbed a tissue, pretending to wipe the desk, and in one smooth motion, collected a few strands of her hair that had fallen. Is everything set? She asked, flashing him a smile. Yes, everything's good, Alfred replied, his heart pounding with the weight of his secret. You'll start on Monday and we'll take it from there. They exchanged pleasantries before Valerie left, her excitement palpable. As soon as the door closed behind her, Alfred sat back, staring at the tissue in his hand. His breath was shaky. He had done it. He had what he needed. Now all that was left was to get the test done. 2 days later, Alfred sat in his office, staring at the sealed envelope on his desk. It had arrived earlier that morning, and yet he hadn't been able to open it. He had been preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, he felt an odd mix of fear and anticipation. What if he was wrong? What if he had misread everything? Or worse, what if he was right? His fingers trembled slightly as he picked up the envelope and carefully tore it open. The rustling of the paper seemed unbearably loud in the quiet room. He unfolded the document, his eyes scanning the lines of text, searching for the result, and then he saw it. The test confirmed a 99.9% match. Valerie was his daughter. The revelation hit him like a tidal wave, washing over him with a force that left him breathless. He leaned back in his chair, trying to process the magnitude of what he had just discovered. Valerie, his daughter. All this time, she had been out there, growing up without him, without even knowing who her father was. And Catherine, she had been alive somewhere, raising their child. For a moment, Alfred was overwhelmed by the weight of his emotions. Guilt gnawed at him for not having found them sooner, for having spent years chasing business success while unknowingly losing the most important part of his life. But there was also a spark of something else: hope. He had a daughter. He had a chance to be a father, to reconnect with the woman he had once loved, and to rebuild the family he had never known existed. But how could he tell Valerie? He couldn't just drop this bombshell on her without any warning. She didn't even know he had been with her mother. And Catherine, what if she didn't remember him at all? He had to be careful. He had to approach this with caution, or he risked losing everything. That evening, Alfred found himself walking again, much like the day he had first heard Valerie's song. The park was quieter now, the air cool with the coming evening. He needed space to think, to clear his head before making any decisions. As he wandered through the familiar paths, memories of Catherine flooded his mind. The way she had laughed, the way she had looked at him with those deep, soulful eyes. He had loved her with everything he had, and losing her had been the most painful thing he had ever endured. And now, after all this time, he was so close to finding her again. But would she remember him? And even if she did, could they ever rebuild what had been lost? Or had too much time passed, leaving nothing but shadows of what once was? Alfred clenched his fists, feeling the pull of uncertainty tugging at him. He couldn't waste any more time. He had spent 25 years letting his grief and work consume him. Now, he had a second chance, a chance to know his daughter, to find Catherine, and to uncover the truth of what had happened all those years ago. But first, he needed to tell Valerie the truth. The thought made his stomach twist with anxiety. How would she react? Would she feel betrayed, knowing he had gone behind her back to discover the truth? Or would she be relieved to finally know who her father was? Alfred stopped walking, staring at the darkening sky. He had no choice but to tell her. She deserved to know. And whatever happened next, he would face it. No more running, no more hiding behind the walls of his business. The next day, Alfred picked up the phone and dialed Valerie's number. His heart raced as the phone rang, his palms sweaty. "Hello," Valerie's voice came through. "Valerie, it's Alfred. We need to talk." The weight of the words, "we need to talk," hung heavily in the air, and Alfred knew he couldn't back down now. Valerie deserved the truth, even if it threatened to unravel everything he had carefully put in place. His heart pounded as he sat in his office, phone still pressed to his ear, waiting for Valerie's response. "Talk? About what?" Valerie asked. Her voice filled with curiosity, but also a hint of nervousness. Alfred swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. "It's important. I'd like to meet in person if you're available. Could you come by my office later today?" There was a pause on the other end, and Alfred could almost hear Valerie weighing her options. "Sure, I can be there in an hour," she finally replied. "Great. I'll see you then," Alfred said, ending the call. As he hung up the phone, his mind raced with how he would approach the conversation. How did one even begin to explain something like this? Should he tell her everything at once or ease her into the truth? He couldn't decide, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. An hour passed by in agonizing silence. Finally, a knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," Alfred called out, standing as the door opened and Valerie stepped inside. She was dressed simply, as always, but there was an air of quiet confidence about her that reminded him so much of Catherine. He gestured for her to take a seat, trying to keep his expression neutral, though inside, he was anything but calm. "So, what's going on?" Valerie asked, her eyes scanning his face as if trying to read the situation. Alfred hesitated for a moment, then decided there was no point in delaying it any further. He had to be honest. "Valerie, I need to tell you something that might come as a shock." Valerie's eyebrows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Taking a deep breath, Alfred began, "You told me your mother's name is Catherine, and that she's been unwell for a long time. I didn't say anything at the time because I wasn't sure. But there's something you need to know about your mother and me." Valerie's eyes widened slightly, a mixture of confusion and apprehension crossing her face. "What are you talking about? You knew my mother?" Alfred nodded, feeling the words catch in his throat. "Yes, a long time ago. Catherine and we were very close. In fact, we were in love." Valerie blinked, clearly trying to process the information. You were in love with my mother?" "Yes," Alfred confirmed, his voice soft. "But then, one day, she disappeared. I spent years searching for her, but I never found out what happened to her, until now." Valerie's hands tightened on the armrests of her chair. "I don't understand. What does this have to do with me?" Alfred's pulse quickened. This was it. The moment of truth. He reached into his desk drawer, pulling out the DNA test results. "I took the liberty of running a DNA test," he said, handing the paper to Valerie. "It confirmed something I had suspected since the day I met you." Valerie stared at the paper, her hands shaking slightly as she read the results. Her face went pale as the words sank in. No, this can't be right," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's true, Valerie," Alfred said gently, leaning forward. "You're my daughter." For a moment, there was nothing but stunned silence. Valerie's eyes darted from the paper to Alfred and back again, as if searching for a mistake, some kind of explanation that made more sense than the one staring her in the face. "I'm your daughter," she repeated, disbelief lacing every word. Alfred nodded slowly. "Yes, Catherine must have been pregnant when she disappeared. I had no idea. If I had known, I would have done everything in my power to find both of you." Valerie stood abruptly, pushing the paper away from her as if it burned her. "No, this doesn't make sense. My mother never mentioned you, not once. She never talked about my father. She always said he wasn't in the picture." Alfred could see the storm of emotions swirling behind Valerie's eyes. Shock, confusion, anger. He couldn't blame her. This wasn't something anyone could process easily. He stood as well, trying to maintain a calm, reassuring tone. "I know it's a lot to take in, but I swear to you, Valerie, I didn't know. Your mother's disappearance. It was a complete mystery to me." Valerie turned away, her hands gripping the back of the chair as she tried to steady herself. "If this is true, then why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she ever say anything about you?" Alfred took a cautious step forward. "That's what I want to find out. Your mother's condition, her memory issues. Maybe she doesn't remember, or maybe she couldn't bring herself to talk about it. But if you'll let me, I'd like to meet her. I want to try to understand what happened." Valerie's shoulders sagged, and she shook her head. "I don't know. This is too much. It's too much." "I know," Alfred said softly. "I can't imagine how overwhelming this must be for you. But I'm here. Whatever you need, whatever questions you have, I'm here to answer them." Valerie turned back around, her eyes searching his for something. Reassurance, maybe, or a sense of truth. "This is insane. I don't know what to believe." Alfred stepped closer, his voice filled with sincerity. "Believe that I've been searching for answers for years, and now that I've found you, I don't want to lose the chance to know you." Valerie's breath hitched, and for a long moment, she simply stood there, silent. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'm ready for this." Alfred nodded, I understand. Take all the time you need. But I would like to meet your mother. I think it's important. Maybe it will help both of us understand what really happened." Valerie hesitated, then slowly nodded. "Okay, I'll take you to her. But I can't promise anything." Alfred's heart swelled with a mix of hope and trepidation. This was the first step, toward the truth, toward closure, and perhaps toward something even greater. The drive to Valerie's house felt like an eternity to Alfred. His mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest as they navigated through the city streets and into quieter, more residential neighborhoods. Every second that passed brought him closer to something he had long thought impossible, the chance to see Catherine again. The woman who had disappeared from his life 25 years ago, the love he had never truly let go of. But now, after everything he'd learned, he wasn't sure what to expect. Valerie sat in the passenger seat, silent for most of the drive. She had barely spoken after agreeing to take Alfred to meet her mother. He could feel the tension radiating from her, the confusion and uncertainty still fresh in her mind. He didn't press her for more conversation. He understood that she needed time to process everything, just as he did. Finally, they arrived at a modest house tucked away on a quiet street. It was nothing like the grand estate Alfred had envisioned spending his life in with Catherine. This was small, humble, a life far removed from the one they had dreamed of together. "This is it," Valerie said softly, breaking the silence as she unbuckled her seatbelt. "She's inside." Alfred nodded, taking a deep breath to steady himself before stepping out of the car. His hands were shaking slightly, his emotions a whirlwind of anticipation, fear, and longing. He followed Valerie to the front door, each step feeling heavier than the last. Valerie paused before unlocking the door, glancing at Alfred as if giving him one last chance to turn back. "She doesn't remember much about the past," she warned. "Sometimes she has good days, but mostly, she's just not the same person she used to be." Alfred swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. "I understand. I just need to see her." With that, Valerie opened the door and led him inside. The house was quiet, the soft ticking of a clock in the background, the only sound. It was a simple home, but it was warm, lived in. Photographs lined the walls, most of them of Valerie at different stages of her life. There were no photos of Catherine from years past, though, nothing that hinted at the life she had once shared with Alfred. "She's in the living room," Valerie said, leading him down a narrow hallway. As they entered the room, Alfred's breath caught in his throat. There, sitting in an armchair by the window, was Catherine. Her hair, once vibrant and full of life, was now streaked with gray, and her face had aged. But she was unmistakably the woman he had loved. The same woman he had searched for. The same woman who had haunted his dreams for over 2 decades. She looked up as they entered, her eyes distant, as if she were somewhere else entirely. There was no spark of recognition when she saw Alfred, no flicker of memory. She simply blinked, offering a vague smile, the kind you give to a stranger. "Mom," Valerie said gently, stepping forward. "This is Alfred. He's someone I want you to meet." Catherine tilted her head slightly, as if trying to process the information. "Alfred," she repeated, her voice soft and unfamiliar. "Do I know you?" Alfred's heart clenched painfully. He had prepared himself for this, but nothing could have truly braced him for the reality of it. She didn't remember him. The love they had shared, the plans they had made, it was all gone, erased from her memory as if it had never existed. I don't know," Alfred managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "But we were very close once, a long time ago." Catherine's brow furrowed slightly, as if she were trying to grasp at something just out of reach. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment. "I don't remember much these days. Things from the past, they get blurry." Valerie watched the exchange with a mixture of sadness and helplessness. She had lived with this version of her mother for years, But for Alfred, this was all new. She could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of realization sinking in. "Maybe you two can sit and talk for a while," Valerie suggested quietly. "I'll give you some space." Alfred nodded, though he wasn't sure what he would say. How could he talk to Catherine, knowing that the person he had loved so deeply no longer remembered him? Still, he wasn't ready to give up. He wasn't ready to walk away from her again. Valerie left the room, leaving Alfred and Catherine alone. The silence between them was heavy, but Alfred finally broke it. "You used to hum a song," he said softly, sitting down across from her. "A melody that I heard not too long ago. Valerie was humming it, just like you used to." Catherine's eyes flickered with something, perhaps a trace of recognition, though it was faint. "I used to sing," she said slowly, her voice distant, "but I can't remember why." "You sang it to me," Alfred said gently, "when we were together?" She frowned, her gaze drifting toward the window. "Together?" Alfred leaned forward, desperate to reach her. "Catherine, you were my whole world once. We were going to build a life together, and then you disappeared. I searched for you for years, but I never found you." Catherine's expression remained blank, though her eyes clouded over as if something was trying to break through. "I don't remember," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't remember." The room fell into silence again, and Alfred felt his heart sink. He had been foolish to think this would be simple. There were too many years between them, too many gaps in her memory that couldn't be filled with just a few words. But just as he was about to lose hope, Catherine's hand reached out, resting lightly on his. Her touch was warm, familiar, even though her face remained distant. "I don't remember," she repeated, "but I feel like I should." Alfred's breath caught in his throat, a small flicker of hope igniting in his chest. "Maybe, in time, you will," he whispered. Catherine nodded slightly, her gaze still far away. But for the first time, there was a glimmer of something that told Alfred that the woman he had loved was still there, buried deep beneath the years of lost memories. And that was enough for now. The following days passed in a haze of emotions for Alfred. He visited Catherine often, sometimes accompanied by Valerie, sometimes alone. Each visit felt like a delicate dance, balancing between hope and heartache. Catherine remained distant, her memory fragmented, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where Alfred caught glimpses of the woman she used to be. It was like watching a fog lift, only to settle again just as quickly. One afternoon, Alfred arrived at the house to find Catherine sitting by the window, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the outline of a flower on the windowsill. Valerie had gone out to run errands, leaving them alone once more. "Hello, Catherine," Alfred greeted her gently, taking his usual seat across from her. She looked up at him, her expression soft but still clouded with that distant look he had come to expect. "Hello, Alfred," she replied, her voice quiet and unsure, as if she was still trying to place him in the puzzle of her mind. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, trying to keep the conversation light, though the weight of his emotions threatened to surface with every word. Catherine hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window. "I've been thinking about something from long ago," she murmured, "but it's all so blurry." Alfred's heart skipped a beat. This was how it always started, these fragments of memory, these tiny threads that might lead to something more. He leaned forward slightly, keeping his voice steady. "What do you remember?" Catherine furrowed her brow, her fingers still tracing the flower's outline. "A man. There was a man. I think I loved him, but it feels so far away now, like it was from another life." She paused, her eyes narrowing in concentration. "He used to hold me, and we would talk about our future. We were going to get married, I think." Alfred's breath caught. "Do you remember his name?" Catherine frowned, her frustration evident as she struggled to pull the memory from the depths of her mind. I don't know. It's like it's right there, but I can't reach it. Alfred swallowed hard, his chest tightening with a mix of hope and despair. He wanted so desperately for her to remember, to see him not as a stranger, but as the man she had once loved. But he knew he couldn't push her. The memories would have to come back in their own time, if they ever did. "It's okay," he said softly, trying to ease her frustration. "Take your time. Sometimes memories come back when we least expect them." Catherine sighed, her fingers pausing in their tracing. "It's been so long, hasn't it? I feel like I've forgotten so much of my life. There are days when I wonder if I'll ever remember it all." Alfred nodded, though the sadness in her voice tugged at him. "Whatever you can remember is enough," he reassured her. "We can take it one step at a time." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared past hanging in the air between them. Alfred couldn't help but wonder how much more Catherine would be able to recall, if anything at all. But as he studied her, he realized that even without her memories, there was still something familiar about her. The way she moved, the way her voice softened when she spoke. It was all still there, buried beneath the years of pain and confusion. Then, unexpectedly, Catherine spoke again. "I keep seeing a face," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "A man with dark eyes. I don't think he was the one I loved, but he's there, in my memories, like a shadow." Alfred stiffened at her words. "A man with dark eyes. Could it be... Do you remember anything else about him?" he asked carefully, trying not to let the tension show in his voice. Catherine closed her eyes, her face tightening as she tried to focus. "He was angry. I don't know why, but he scared me. I think he took me somewhere. I remember being afraid, and then nothing. Everything goes dark." Alfred's heart raced. He knew, deep down, who that man was. Stephen. It had to be. Catherine's ex-husband, his former business partner, had always been jealous of the relationship Alfred had shared with her. And now, it seemed that Stephen was somehow tied to her disappearance. He had never suspected Stephen of being directly involved, but hearing Catherine mention him brought back a flood of old suspicions. Could Stephen have orchestrated the whole thing? Could he have been the one responsible for Catherine's disappearance all those years ago? Alfred clenched his fists, trying to keep his emotions in check. He didn't want to alarm Catherine, not when she was just beginning to remember. But the rage that simmered inside him was hard to ignore. If Stephen had done this, if he had taken Catherine from him. "What else do you remember about him?" Alfred pressed gently, though his voice was tight. Catherine shook her head, her eyes still closed. "Not much. Just flashes. He was angry, and I was scared, and then everything is blank." Alfred forced himself to breathe, to calm the storm building inside him. He couldn't let himself spiral into anger. Not yet. He needed to think this through, to understand what had happened before he made any rash decisions. "Thank you for telling me, Catherine," he said softly, reaching out to gently touch her hand. "You don't need to remember everything all at once. We'll figure it out together." Catherine opened her eyes, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of recognition in them, just a fleeting spark, but it was enough to give Alfred hope. "I don't know if I'll ever remember everything," she whispered, "but I think I was happy once. With him." Alfred's chest tightened, but he managed a small smile. "You were," he said softly, "and you can be happy again. We'll take it one day at a time." Catherine smiled faintly, her hand resting in his, and for the first time in years, Alfred felt a flicker of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what had been lost. But even as that hope took root, a darker thought lingered at the back of his mind. Stephen. If he had been involved in Catherine's disappearance, then Alfred couldn't rest until he knew the full truth, and he wouldn't stop until justice was served. Alfred couldn't shake the weight of Catherine's words from their last conversation. The mention of a man with dark eyes, angry, frightening, and tied to her disappearance, had left a gnawing suspicion in the pit of his stomach. Everything pointed to one person, Stephen, his former business partner, the man who had once been close to him but had harbored jealousy and resentment for years. The more Alfred thought about it, the clearer it became. Stephen had always been possessive, particularly when it came to Catherine. Back in the day, Alfred had brushed it off as simple envy, believing that their friendship and business relationship could withstand such tensions. But now, with Catherine's fragmented memories surfacing, it was becoming harder to deny that Stephen's involvement might go far deeper than Alfred had ever realized. He couldn't confront this alone. Alfred knew he needed to get to the bottom of what had happened, and the only person who could help him piece together the truth was Catherine herself, if her memories could return in time. But Valerie also deserved to know. She had lived her whole life unaware of what had really happened to her mother. It was time for her to understand the full story. The next afternoon, Alfred met Valerie at a cafe near her house. She was quiet as she sat down across from him, her eyes reflecting the same uncertainty and confusion she had carried since he had revealed the truth about her parentage. "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me," she began, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "About my mother, and about you being my father. It's still hard to believe." "I understand," Alfred replied, his voice calm but serious. "It's a lot to take in, and I don't expect you to accept everything overnight. But there's something else you need to know. Something about your mother's past that I think is starting to come back to her." Valerie frowned, setting her cup down. "What do you mean?" Alfred leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly. "Your mother has been remembering things, bits and pieces of her life before she disappeared. And she's mentioned someone. A man with dark eyes. Someone who frightened her. Someone who she believes took her away." Valerie's eyes widened slightly. "Are you saying someone kidnapped her?" Alfred nodded, his jaw tightening. "I believe so. And I think that man was Stephen, my former business partner. He knew Catherine back then, and I've always suspected he had feelings for her. But I never thought he would go as far as to take her away and keep her hidden." Valerie looked at him in disbelief. Why would he do that? And why didn't anyone find out? "I don't know all the details yet," Alfred admitted. "But if Stephen was behind her disappearance, he must have been careful. He had the resources and the connections to make it difficult to trace her. I believe that's why she ended up in that small village, with no memory of what happened." Valerie's face darkened, her hands gripping the edges of the table. And all this time, she's been living with the trauma of it, without even realizing what was done to her. "Yes," Alfred said softly, the weight of guilt pressing on him. "I never suspected Stephen was capable of something like this. I should have seen the signs, but I didn't." Valerie shook her head, anger flashing in her eyes. "So what do we do now? How do we prove he was behind it? It's been so many years, and my mother doesn't even remember most of it." "We need to be careful," Alfred cautioned. "I don't want to push your mother too hard. If she remembers more, we'll have something to go on. But we also need to be prepared for the possibility that Stephen might try to interfere. He's still out there, and I wouldn't be surprised if he tries to cover his tracks." Valerie's jaw clenched, her determination clear. "He can't get away with this, not after everything he's done to her, and to us." Alfred nodded, feeling a surge of pride in his daughter's strength. "We'll get justice, Valerie. I promise you that. But we need to gather more information before we confront him. Your mother is the key to all of this." Valerie was silent for a moment, her emotions clearly in turmoil. But finally, she looked up at Alfred with a fierce resolve in her eyes. "I'll help. Whatever it takes. If my mother can't remember everything, then we'll find another way. But we can't let him get away with this." Alfred reached across the table, placing his hand gently over Valerie's. "Thank you. he said quietly. "We'll get through this together. I'll protect both of you, no matter what." That evening, Alfred returned to Catherine's house, hoping to find more pieces of the puzzle. He found her sitting by the window again, staring out at the fading light of the day. There was a peacefulness about her, but also a sadness that never seemed to fade. "Hello, Catherine," he greeted her softly, taking a seat beside her. She turned to him, her expression still distant but a bit more focused than before. "Hello, Alfred," she replied, her voice tinged with something almost like recognition. "Do you remember anything from earlier?" Alfred asked gently, watching her face for any sign of the memories trying to break through. Catherine frowned slightly, her fingers playing with the edge of her blanket. "I've been thinking about that man again, the one with the dark eyes." Alfred felt a jolt of tension. "What do you remember about him?" She hesitated, her brow furrowing in concentration. "He was angry. I remember being afraid of him. He said he loved me, but it didn't feel like love. It felt wrong." Alfred's fists clenched at her words. "Stephen, it had to be him. Did he take you somewhere? Do you remember where he brought you?" Catherine's face tightened, and she shook her head slowly. "I don't know. Everything went dark. After that, I don't remember much. Just fear. And then, I woke up somewhere far away, alone." Alfred's heart ached for her, but there was also a burning rage inside him. Stephen had done this. He had torn Catherine away from him, from their life together, and had left her to suffer in isolation, without any memory of who she was or what had happened. "Thank you for telling me, Catherine," he said softly, reaching out to take her hand. "We'll figure this out. I promise." Catherine looked at him, her eyes searching his for a long moment. Then, for the first time since their reunion, she spoke with a clarity that made Alfred's heart skip a beat. "I think I was trying to get away from him," she whispered, "but something went wrong." Alfred's pulse quickened. This was it, another piece of the puzzle, and with it, the truth was slowly but surely coming to light. Alfred left Catherine's house that evening with a sense of clarity and purpose he hadn't felt in years. The fragments of Catherine's memory were starting to align, and the truth about what had happened to her was becoming clearer with each passing day. Stephen had to be held accountable for what he had done, but Alfred knew they needed more than just Catherine's fading memories to bring him to justice. The next morning, Alfred met Valerie at his office to discuss their plan. They sat in the conference room, papers spread across the table as they tried to piece together the events from the past. "We need to gather as much evidence as we can," Alfred said, his voice firm but calm. "It's been 25 years, and memories alone won't be enough to convict Stephen. We need to find witnesses, documents, anything that can connect him to your mother's disappearance." Valerie nodded, her face set in determination. "Do you think there are still people who might remember something? I mean, it's been so long." "There might be," Alfred replied. "Stephen had a lot of contacts back then, and not all of them were on the right side of the law. If we can find someone who was involved in whatever he did to Catherine, they might be willing to talk now." Valerie leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping the edge of the table. "What about the village where she ended up? There might be people there who remember her, or who might have seen something suspicious around the time she arrived." Alfred considered this, nodding thoughtfully. "That's a good idea. If we can find anyone who remembers the circumstances of her arrival, if they saw who brought her there or noticed anything strange, that could help us." Valerie crossed her arms, a flicker of worry crossing her face. "But even if we find people who remember, will they be willing to testify? I mean, Stephen was a powerful man. He could have threatened them, or worse." Alfred's jaw tightened at the thought. "We'll deal with that if it comes to it. But we need to start somewhere. If we can find one person willing to speak, it might encourage others to come forward." Valerie hesitated for a moment, then asked the question that had been weighing on both of their minds. "What if Stephen finds out what we're doing? What if he tries to stop us? Alfred looked her in the eye, his voice steady and unwavering. He won't. I won't let him. I've spent years playing by the rules, building my business and staying out of conflicts like this. But this is different. This is about your mother. And now it's about you too. Stephen can't hurt us anymore. Valerie nodded, though the tension in her shoulders didn't fully relax. She had grown up in a world where she and her mother had lived in fear, and the thought of confronting someone like Stephen was daunting. But she trusted Alfred. He had already shown her that he was willing to fight for their family, no matter what it took. A few days later, Alfred and Valerie drove to the small village where Catherine had lived after her disappearance. It was a quiet, unassuming place, tucked away in the countryside. As they pulled into the village square, Alfred couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. This was where Catherine had been abandoned, where she had lived alone with no memory of her past. It was hard to imagine the pain she must have endured here, not knowing who she was or what had happened to her. They began by speaking to a few of the villagers, asking subtle questions about whether they remembered a woman named Catherine arriving in the village many years ago. At first, they were met with polite indifference. Most people didn't seem to remember anything out of the ordinary. But as they continued to ask around, they found an older woman who recalled something unusual. "I remember her," the woman said, her voice tinged with sympathy. "She arrived one day, out of the blue. No one knew where she came from, and she didn't talk much. It was like she didn't know who she was." Alfred's heart raced. "Did you ever see anyone with her? A man, perhaps?" The woman thought for a moment, then shook her head. "No, not that I can recall. She was always alone when I saw her. But there was a rumor back then." Valerie leaned in, her eyes wide with curiosity. "A rumor?" The woman nodded. "Some people said they saw a man drop her off late at night, but no one could ever say who he was. He disappeared right after and she never talked about him." Alfred exchanged a glance with Valerie, his pulse quickening. This was something, finally, a lead. "Do you remember anything else?" Alfred pressed gently. "Anything about the man? Or how Catherine seemed after she arrived?" The woman hesitated, then shook her head. "I'm afraid that's all I can recall. She kept to herself after that. It wasn't until much later that she started to have those episodes." "Episodes?" Valerie asked, frowning. The woman nodded sadly. "She would forget things, or get confused about where she was. It got worse over time. People tried to help her, but there wasn't much we could do." Alfred thanked the woman for her time, though his mind was already racing ahead. This confirmed what he had suspected. Catherine had been left in the village by someone, likely Stephen, and her memory issues had begun soon after. But there had to be more. They needed more concrete evidence. That evening, back at Alfred's office, they sifted through the information they had gathered. While it wasn't enough to directly incriminate Stephen, it was a start. The rumor about the man dropping off Catherine was significant, but it was still just hearsay. They needed something stronger. "I've been thinking," Alfred said, pacing the room. "Stephen had a network of contacts, people he did business with outside the law. If we can find someone who worked for him back then, someone who knew about his personal life, we might be able to get the proof we need." Valerie nodded, though her expression was grim. "And how do we find those people?" Stephen was good at covering his tracks. Alfred stopped pacing, his mind sharp with focus. "I still have connections in the business world. People who know people. If Stephen thought he could hide from me forever, he's mistaken." Valerie looked at him, her determination matching his. "Let's do it. Whatever it takes, we'll find the truth." As Alfred made the necessary calls, gathering leads and building their case, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, and he was closer than ever to exposing the man who had stolen his future, his love, and his family. But deep down, Alfred knew that once they cornered Stephen, the confrontation would be dangerous. this wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about righting a wrong that had destroyed their lives. And Alfred was prepared to fight for Catherine, for Valerie, and for the justice that had been denied for far too long. Alfred knew that confronting Stephen directly was a dangerous gamble, but it was a risk he had to take. The pieces were falling into place, and although they didn't yet have every shred of evidence, they had enough to force Stephen's hand. More than that, Alfred knew that Valerie and Catherine deserved answers, and they couldn't wait any longer. Through his network of old contacts, Alfred had managed to track down Stephen's location. Despite the years that had passed, Stephen was still as powerful as ever, hiding behind his wealth and influence. But Alfred had one thing that Stephen didn't: the truth. And the truth, once revealed, could tear down everything Stephen had built. "Are you sure about this?" Valerie asked as they sat in Alfred's office, preparing for what was to come. Alfred looked at her, his expression unwavering. "I'm sure. We can't let him get away with this any longer. It's time he faces what he did." Valerie nodded, though Alfred could see the tension in her eyes. She was ready, but the weight of what they were about to do clearly troubled her. She had never known this side of life: the secrets, the lies, the betrayals that came with power and influence. But she had inherited her mother's strength, and that gave Alfred confidence that they could face whatever came next. They drove to Stephen's estate in silence. The tension in the car was palpable, both of them knowing that this could end in any number of ways. As they approached the sprawling mansion, Alfred felt a rush of memories, years of business deals, partnerships, and, later, the bitter dissolution of their friendship. He had never imagined they would end up here, on opposite sides, with the truth of Catherine's disappearance hanging between them like a guillotine. "Stay close to me," Alfred told Valerie as they exited the car. "No matter what happens, don't let him provoke you. We'll handle this together." Valerie nodded, her jaw tight with determination. She had every right to be angry, but Alfred didn't want her emotions to get the better of her. Stephen was manipulative, and he would surely try to twist things to his advantage. But Alfred was prepared for that. They were escorted into Stephen's study by his staff, the room as grand and imposing as Alfred remembered. Stephen sat behind a massive oak desk, his dark eyes gleaming with the same arrogance that had once made Alfred wary of him. He stood as they entered, a smile playing on his lips that didn't reach his eyes. Well, Alfred," Stephen said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this unexpected visit?" Alfred didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We need to talk about Catherine." Stephen's expression barely flickered, but Alfred caught the brief moment of surprise that crossed his face before it vanished behind a mask of indifference. "Catherine?" Stephen repeated, feigning confusion. "I haven't heard that name in years. Why bring her up now?" Alfred stepped forward, his eyes locked on Stephen's. "Don't play games with me. We know what you did. Catherine is alive, Stephen. And she's starting to remember." The air in the room grew tense. Valerie stood by Alfred's side, her fists clenched at her sides, but she remained silent, just as Alfred had instructed. Stephen's smile faded, his expression turning cold. "I don't know what you think you know, Alfred, but you're making a mistake by coming here and throwing around accusations." "I'm not here to make accusations," Alfred said, his voice calm but resolute. "I'm here to give you a chance to confess. You took her. You destroyed her life and mine. And now you're going to face the consequences." For the first time, a flicker of something darker passed across Stephen's face. Anger, maybe even fear. He stood up slowly, his posture stiff, his hands resting on the desk as he leaned forward. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Alfred countered, taking a step closer. "Catherine remembers you. She remembers the fear, the anger, the way you took her away from everything she loved. She may not have all her memories back yet, but it's only a matter of time." Stephen's eyes narrowed, and Alfred could see the mask of control beginning to slip. "You're a fool, Alfred. You always were. You had everything handed to you, your success, your wealth, even Catherine. You never appreciated any of it. And you couldn't stand it, could you? Alfred shot back. That's why you took her. Because you couldn't handle the fact that she chose me. Stephen's face twisted with rage, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the desk. I did what I had to do. Catherine was better off without you. She needed someone who could give her a real life, not someone who was too busy chasing deals and meetings to notice what he had. Alfred felt his anger rising, but he forced himself to stay calm. You didn't give her a life. You took it from her. And now, she's finally going to get it back. Stephen sneered. You think you can waltz in here after all these years and tear me down? I built everything I have with my own hands, and I won't let you or anyone else take that from me. This isn't about your empire, Stephen, Alfred said, his voice steady. It's about justice. For Catherine. For Valerie. He gestured toward his daughter, who stood beside him with a fire in her eyes that made Alfred proud. You didn't just take Catherine from me. You took her from her own daughter. Stephen's eyes flicked to Valerie, a brief moment of recognition flashing across his face before he looked back at Alfred. So that's what this is, he said with a bitter laugh. You found your little lost family and now you want to play the hero. I don't want to play anything, Alfred said sharply. I want the truth, and I want you to pay for what you did. Stephen's expression darkened, and for a moment, Alfred thought he might lash out. But instead, Stephen let out a low, mocking chuckle. You really think you can make this public? That you can take me down? I have more power and more connections than you'll ever know. Alfred's gaze hardened. We'll see about that. You're not invincible, Stephen. Not anymore. Before Stephen could respond, Valerie spoke for the first time, her voice strong and unwavering. You took my mother from me. You took everything from her. But we're going to make sure the world knows the truth. You can't hide behind your money and your lies forever. Stephen's eyes flashed with fury. But before he could say another word, Alfred stepped forward, closing the distance between them. This is your last chance, Stephen. Confess, or we'll go public. We have enough to expose you, and you know it. Stephen stared at Alfred, the tension between them thick in the air. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he straightened up, his face a mask of cold fury. Get out of my house, he snarled. You'll regret this, Alfred. Both of you will. Alfred didn't flinch. We'll see. He turned and motioned for Valerie to follow. As they walked out of Stephen's mansion, the air outside felt lighter, freer, despite the confrontation they had just endured. We did it, Valerie whispered, her voice filled with both relief and anger. Alfred nodded. Yes, but it's not over yet. They had forced Stephen's hand. Now they would make sure he paid for everything he had done. The confrontation with Stephen had left Alfred and Valerie more determined than ever. The anger and fear in Stephen's eyes told Alfred everything he needed to know. Stephen was rattled, and rattled men make mistakes. They had confronted him, but the real battle was still ahead. Now they needed to move quickly to ensure that Stephen's secrets came to light, that Catherine's suffering was finally acknowledged, and that justice was served. Back at his office, Alfred immediately called in every favor he had accumulated over the years. He reached out to lawyers, private investigators, and old business associates, people who knew how to dig up information, especially on someone as well-connected as Stephen. Alfred's contacts in the business world were vast, and he knew there were people who had crossed paths with Stephen in less than legal circumstances. If they could find one of them willing to talk, they would have the leverage they needed to bring Stephen down. Valerie, meanwhile, was determined to do her part. She visited the village again, speaking to the older woman who had first remembered Catherine's arrival. This time, the woman provided more details about the man who had dropped Catherine off. She recalled seeing him only at night, always in a hurry, and how the villagers had noticed Catherine's strange behavior shortly after. He was always nervous, the woman told Valerie, her voice filled with the weight of the memory. Like he was hiding something. No one knew his name, but we all sensed something wasn't right. Valerie took this information back to Alfred, who passed it on to his private investigators. They began following the leads, tracking down people who had worked with Stephen during that time, hoping to find someone who had been involved in whatever scheme Stephen had orchestrated to kidnap and hide Catherine. Within a week, they struck gold. One of Alfred's investigators had located an old associate of Stephen's, a man named Charles. Charles had worked with Stephen on some shady deals years ago, and he had been part of the network Stephen used to cover his tracks. When the investigator contacted Charles, it was clear the man was nervous. He didn't want to be involved, didn't want to talk, but with enough persuasion and a sizable offer of protection, Charles finally agreed to meet with Alfred in person. A few days later, Alfred and Valerie met Charles at a secluded restaurant outside the city. The man looked worn down, the years of hiding secrets etched into the lines on his face. He glanced around nervously, as though expecting someone to be watching, before sliding into the booth opposite Alfred and Valerie. "You've got guts, digging into Stephen's past," Charles said, his voice low. "He's not the kind of man who lets things go." "We know what he's capable of," Alfred replied evenly. "That's why we're here. You helped him hide Catherine, didn't you?" Charles hesitated, then sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I didn't know the full story back then. I thought it was just a business thing. Stephen was always cutting deals, doing whatever he could to get ahead. But when he came to me and said he needed someone taken care of, I should have known it was more than just business." Valerie's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she stayed silent, letting Alfred take the lead. "So you helped him," Alfred pressed. "You helped him take Catherine and hide her away." Charles swallowed hard, his eyes flicking nervously between Alfred and Valerie. "I didn't know who she was. All I knew was that Stephen wanted her out of the picture. He said she was causing problems for him, that she was a distraction. I handled the logistics, got her out of the city, set her up in that village under a new name. After that, I never saw her again." Valerie's voice finally broke through, trembling with anger. "Do you have any idea what you did to her? To us?" Charles looked down, shame crossing his face. "I didn't know it would go this far. I thought she'd be fine. But then Stephen got more paranoid. He started paying me to keep tabs on her, to make sure she stayed hidden. By then, I was too deep in to back out." Alfred leaned forward, his eyes burning with intensity. "You're going to help us bring him down. You've already admitted your part in this. Now you need to testify, publicly. We can protect you, but you need to come forward." Charles hesitated, fear flashing across his face. "You don't understand. Stephen's got powerful connections. He can ruin my life if I go against him." Valerie leaned in, her voice low but fierce. "He already ruined ours. He took my mother from me. He destroyed everything she had. Don't you think it's time he faced the consequences?" Charles's gaze dropped to the table. There was a long pause before he finally nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "All right, I'll testify. I'll give you everything I know." With Charles's testimony secured, Alfred wasted no time. His lawyers prepared the case, gathering the evidence they had collected, from Catherine's medical records to witness statements from the village. Charles's testimony was the linchpin, and once they had his statement, everything began to fall into place. Within days, the legal wheels began turning. Alfred's team filed a lawsuit against Stephen, and the media quickly picked up the story. It didn't take long for the news to spread. Headlines everywhere declared the shocking revelations about Stephen's involvement in the abduction and manipulation of Catherine's life. The media frenzy was intense, and soon Stephen's empire was under fire. Alfred and Valerie watched the events unfold with a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. Stephen, who had once seemed untouchable, was now being dragged into the spotlight, forced to answer for his crimes. It wasn't long before he was arrested, the weight of his lies finally crashing down around him. In the courtroom, Alfred and Valerie sat side by side, watching as Stephen's arrogance crumbled before the evidence stacked against him. Charles's testimony was damning, and as the trial progressed, more and more witnesses came forward. People who had worked with Stephen, who had seen his ruthless behavior firsthand. The case built against him was airtight. Finally, the day came when the verdict was read. Stephen was found guilty on multiple counts, including kidnapping, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The sentence was harsh, and as the judge declared Stephen's fate, Alfred felt a wave of relief wash over him. Justice had been done. As they left the courtroom, Alfred turned to Valerie, his heart full. "We did it," he said quietly. Valerie nodded, though her expression was solemn. "Yeah, but it doesn't bring back the years we lost." Alfred placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice gentle. "No, it doesn't. But we have now. We have the future. And that's something Stephen can never take from us." Valerie smiled faintly, a spark of hope finally breaking through the sadness in her eyes. "I guess that's true." They had won the battle. And now, for the first time in years, Alfred felt that maybe, just maybe, they could finally begin to heal. The trial had come and gone, and with it, the heavy burden that had weighed on Alfred, Valerie, and Catherine for years. Stephen was now behind bars, his once powerful empire reduced to ruins. The world had seen him for who he truly was, a manipulative, dangerous man who had destroyed lives for his own gain. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was a sense of closure. But as Alfred stood outside the courthouse with Valerie by his side, he knew that the real work was just beginning. Justice had been served, but the scars left behind by Stephen's actions would take time to heal. Catherine had been through more than anyone should ever endure, and though the memories of her past were slowly coming back, they were fractured, fragile. She would need time, and so would Alfred and Valerie. They visited Catherine that evening, sitting with her in the small living room of the house where she had spent so many lost years. Valerie had decided to move in with her for the time being, to help care for her as she continued to recover. Catherine had good days and bad days, and though her memory was returning bit by bit, there were still pieces of the past she struggled to grasp. Alfred sat across from her, watching as she absent-mindedly smoothed out the blanket on her lap. There was a quiet peace in the room, a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. It was as though the weight of the secrets and lies that had once surrounded them had finally lifted, leaving space for something new to grow. "Do you feel different now that it's all over?" Catherine asked softly, her eyes drifting toward Alfred. Her voice was steady, but there was still a faint tremble, as if she were afraid of what the answer might be. Alfred smiled gently. "Yes, I do. It's not the kind of closure I ever imagined, but it's something, and it means we can finally start moving forward." Catherine nodded, though her expression remained thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that. Moving forward, I mean, it's strange, isn't it? I spent so many years not knowing who I was, not remembering anything from my past, and now, even though some of the memories are coming back, I still feel lost." Valerie, who had been sitting beside her mother, reached out and took her hand. "You're not lost, Mom. You're here with us now. That's what matters." Catherine smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I know. I just wish I could remember it all, you know? I want to be the person I was before, but I don't even know who that is anymore." Alfred felt a pang of sadness at her words. He understood her struggle, the sense of displacement that came with regaining a past that had been stolen. But he also knew that Catherine didn't need to be the person she had been before. She could be whoever she wanted to be now, with them by her side. "You don't have to remember everything," Alfred said softly. "What's important is that we're here now, together. We'll take it one step at a time, just like we have been." Catherine looked at him, her gaze softening. "You've changed, Alfred," she said quietly. "You're not the man I remember." Alfred smiled faintly. "A lot of things have changed, but some things haven't. I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped hoping." Catherine's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a moment they simply sat there, letting the silence speak for itself. There were no words that could fully capture the years of loss, pain, and longing they had both endured. But now, with the truth finally out in the open, they could begin to rebuild, slowly, carefully, but together. Over the next few months, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Valerie continued to work at Alfred's company, finding her place within the business world and slowly embracing the role of his daughter. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments when the weight of everything that had happened hung heavily between them. But their bond was growing stronger with each passing day. Catherine, too, was finding her way. She had started seeing a therapist to help her work through the trauma and the gaps in her memory. And though the process was slow, she was making progress. There were days when she felt overwhelmed by the past, by everything she had lost. But there were also moments of light. Moments when she laughed with Valerie or shared quiet conversations with Alfred. Moments when she could almost feel whole again. Alfred, for his part, had thrown himself into supporting both Catherine and Valerie. His business was still thriving, but it no longer consumed him the way it once had. He had learned, through years of pain and isolation, that there were more important things than power or success. He had a family now, a family that had been shattered and rebuilt from the ground up, and that was worth more than any deal he could ever make. One evening, several months after the trial, the three of them sat together in the backyard of Catherine's house, enjoying the warmth of the summer air. Valerie had brought home dinner from one of their favorite restaurants, and they ate in comfortable silence, the soft sounds of the evening filling the air. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the yard, Catherine looked at Alfred, her eyes filled with a quiet, steady peace. "I've been thinking," she said softly, setting down her drink, "about what's next." Alfred raised an eyebrow, curious. "What do you mean?" Catherine smiled, a hint of her old self shining through. "I don't want to live in the past anymore. I've spent too much time there already. I want to move forward, to start living again." Valerie smiled, reaching over to squeeze her mother's hand. "I think that's a great idea, Mom." Alfred nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "I couldn't agree more. Whatever you want to do, we'll be with you every step of the way." Catherine looked at both of them, her smile growing wider. "I think it's time to sell this house. It's been my refuge for so long, but it's also tied to everything that happened. I want to find somewhere new, somewhere we can all start fresh." Alfred and Valerie exchanged a glance, both of them nodding in agreement. "Then that's what we'll do," Alfred said, his voice filled with determination. "We'll find a new place, a new beginning." Catherine's eyes sparkled with emotion as she looked at the two most important people in her life. "Thank you," she whispered, "for never giving up on me, on us." Alfred smiled, his heart full. "We're a family, Catherine, and we always will be." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of pink and purple, Alfred, Catherine, and Valerie sat together in the fading light. They had been through so much, more than any family should ever have to endure. But now, with the past finally behind them, they could look toward the future with hope. A new beginning, a new life, together